Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka we're gonna recap the best cards in Mythical Islands. I did a video a couple weeks ago as soon as the set released, giving my top 15 cards from Mythical Island, and I think it's time to revisit that ranking as we kind of understand what cards are good so far and for the most part will be good for a while, at least until the end of the month when we finally get the new 200 plus card expansion, which that will be an absolute banger. I cannot wait for that. But let's get into these rankings and let's talk about them. So this is a card that actually fell out of my top 15 for a few reasons. It's just not really played in a lot of the decks that, really would probably be able to cater to it. And, it's just kind of one of those cards that just doesn't really have a spot. Mewtwo decks just don't really want to play it. There's just not enough room. Maybe in decks like Gengar and Alakazam that are kind of gimmicky as it is, maybe those decks can kind of fit it for now. But this card definitely fell out of my top 15 and it was ranked at number 15. So that is the first card that fell out. Another card that fell out of my top 15 was Tauros, and Tauros was ranked at number 11. Now, the reason why this card has kind of fallen out is it's just not really usable in a lot of the situations where you would hope it was usable. A lot of decks like the Aerodactyl and Primeape deck are just playing two energy attackers, whether it's Aerodactyl EX or whether it's Marshadow. Or whether it's a one energy attacker and Hitmonlee, and then decks like Golem just don't really have space for this. It's just too many energies, so just didn't really find a good spot. There were some cool decks that were kind of floating around with like Farfetch'd and stuff, but ultimately I just think that this card is just like not as good as some of the other options that you might want to entertain, such as like even a Mew EX or something like that. So yeah, Tauros definitely fell out of my top 15. Then another card that fell out of my top 15, and this was probably the one that was really close to sneaking back in, was Rapidash, because I do think that there is a lot of validity to Rapidash being played in the Blaine's decks. However, the biggest drawback with Rapidash and Blaine right now is that Blaine has been overtaken in the non-EX format. Golem is just straight up usually better and usually able to knock out a Ninetales Blaine deck where Rapidash would see a lot of play. And then you've also got decks like Flareon Druddigon, you've got decks like Tentacruel Greninja that just kind of stomp all over this deck still in that matchup. So really fell out of favor in the no EX format. And then even when you talk about like just the open format, Blaine is just not powerful enough to stick in that meta. You have to flip a lot of heads with this specific Rapidash, and you have to hope that the other opponent that you're playing is just like bricking a lot of the time. So that's just kind of the big reason why this fell out of my top 15, even though it was previously ranked number 12. The last card that fell out of the top 15 is going to be Scolipede, and that just happens to be because the numbers on this deck when it comes to tournament gameplay are just awful. It beats just about two decks in the entire meta that are pretty much played a lot, and for the most part against the other decks it just gets bodied. Now there's a lot of reasons for that, but basically just right now I think Scolipede is just kind of in a bad spot, and I think that first weekend was really hyped up because Mewtwo was just this big bad, and obviously not a lot of people saw Gyarados coming, and after that first weekend, Scolipede just about, steadily has declined in play rate, and its numbers continue to be pretty awful. But let's get to the actual top 15 cards, and let's talk about them. So, coming in at number 15, this card was actually previously not ranked at all in my top 15. And one of the big reasons why I think Budding Expeditioner makes this list is because there are spots where this card is very handy and very necessary. There's decks that are playing Arcanine, Mew EX, and Budding Expeditioner, and that really flows well together. There's even some Mewtwo Gardevoir decks that have teched one Budding Expeditioner and a couple of Mews to kind of soak some damage and then retreat it, basically, pull it back to their hand. There's just a lot of different instances where it's not necessarily like like win you the mirror match all the time, or it's not gonna necessarily like blow people out a lot of the time. But it's a card that I think is pretty strong, and maybe in the future could potentially be even stronger. Now, maybe some other decks will get cooked up with Budding Expeditioner as well. There's Executor Mew EX decks, but I don't think there's a lot of room for Budding Expeditioner. Maybe in one of the decks that was only playing Executor and Mew EX as basically the only Pokemon, maybe that deck has room. But again, I do think that there are cards that may be slightly better, including other supporter cards that may be better. So again, coming in at number 15, Budding Expeditioner. Now moving on to another card on the list, this is number 14, Vaporeon. Previously I had it ranked at number 7. So this is one of the biggest downgrades that I've had on this entire list. And one of the big reasons for that downgrade is I didn't necessarily see Gyarados coming, right? I knew that Gyarados had strong stats. I knew that the attack could be hit or miss in some cases, but I didn't necessarily anticipate Gyarados being the force that it is and being one of those big three. The other thing that kind of really slowed Vaporeon down is that Articuno and Starmie EX definitely fell out of favor in a lot of decks, right? Why play Vaporeon, or excuse me, why play, Articuno EX and why play Starmie EX when I could just go play Gyarados, Druddigon, and Greninja, right? It's just pretty much almost always better. But again, in the future, Vaporeon may have a niche. It may come back into the meta. It may become a factor again. If they print a better EV in particular, that could definitely change things up. Maybe there's other Pokemon that have maybe Gardevoir-like effects where they generate energy and then Vaporeon is able to manipulate them. But again, like Vaporeon, it's not necessarily win more. It's just that it's like an extra brick in your deck, right? It's like an extra thing that can cause you to lose the game just as well as it can cause you to win the game. So again, downgrade for Vaporeon, moving down to number 14. Now moving in at number 13, this card was not on the list previously, but blue has proven to be one of the better cards in the Mewtwo matchup against the Mewtwo deck. So like in the Mewtwo mirror, it's pretty solid. And it also has found application in Pikachu EX decks if you're trying to prevent Marshadow from one-hit KOing you, or if you're trying to prevent Arcanine from one-hit KOing you. Now granted, those decks may be packing Giovanni, so the blue might not even matter, but that's neither here nor there. But again, this card, I have it ranked higher than Budding Expeditioner simply for the fact that it fits into, or can fit into, two of the best three decks, right? And when you talk about the best three decks in the game, it's definitely in no particular order. It's Gyarados, Pikachu, and Mewtwo, right? So when you can fit into two of those decks pretty well and like be effective, I think you got to move this card up on the list, and that's why I have it above Budding Expeditioner. Now Dedenne, now this is another card that I had rated previously as at number 5. I've moved it down to number 12, and here's the thing, it's still like a really, really good card. It's pretty much almost a staple in every Pikachu deck except some of the decks that are playing like base Mewtwo because it has 100 HP and it can take a hit a little bit better, and it still has that 1 retreat cost. They're just kind of conceding the fact that they're never going to attack with the Zapdos pretty much. And with this Dedenne, I do think that it takes the spot that Pinch had in the previous Pikachu decks where, hey, instead of needing 2 energy, you just attack for 1 energy. And in some cases, like, it's the only chance that you have to get back in the game by flipping heads, right? And like sometimes that's just what you have to do. You have to pivot into your Dedenne, you have to flip a heads to buy yourself 1 more turn, and then you can turn the tables on your opponent. So again, I don't think Dedenne is bad. It just happens to be one of those cards that I slid down the list. But again, still a very good card. You're going to see a lot of it in most Pikachu decks. All right, Pidgeot EX. Now this is an interesting card. Previously I had it at number 10. I slid it down just a little bit to number 11. And one of the biggest things that like Pidgeot has that's a problem is it doesn't really have like a nice partner, right? Like that's the biggest issue. You can't really pair it with another stage 2 because then it makes the deck really cloggy. And then when you talk about, cards like Blastoise, it has Misty. Cards like Charizard, well, it has Moltres. Cards like Venusaur, well, hey, dude, it has Erica and it has Superior, even though you probably don't want to play 2 stage 2s. It at least has Executor that pair well with it, right? With Pidgeot EX, it's really tough to find a partner that flows well with it. Even if you use a card like Executor EX, which is very good in the early game, and maybe you pivot into your Pidgeot mid to late game. Well, the problem with Executor is you need to see it, right? And, the games that you don't see Executor, well, now your Pidgeot deck is going to have to survive on Pidgeys and Pidgeotos, which is very tough. So again, I think that this Pokemon lacks a really good partner, and there's other partners out there. There's Mute EX, there's Fighting, with the Hitmonlee stuff. There's all sorts of pairs out there that you can try to maneuver around with, but I just think that it's missing something right now. And for right now, it just doesn't really have a place in the top tier of the meta tournament decks that we're seeing right now. And so that's kind of why I have it down here at 11. But hey, doesn't mean that the card is bad or anything. It's just, not necessarily as good as some of the other EXs that are higher on this list. Speaking of another EX that's higher on this list, let's talk about Aerodactyl. It wasn't rated. It wasn't ranked in my previous top 15. However, I've got it at number 10. And even though this card really only fits into a couple of decks, it's a deck that can counter 2 of the top 3 best decks. And so that's why I have it pretty high on this list, right? Going into a Pikachu deck, this Aerodactyl EX with Primeape, or Aerodactyl EX with, Marshadow, Hitmonlee, however you want to build it, is really, really solid. Even against a deck like Gyarados, the Hitmonlees can snipe the Magikarps and potentially win you the game that way. And then in the Mewtwo matchup, now this is really interesting. There's going to be some Aerodactyl interactions that's going to block Gardevoir from hitting the board for maybe a turn or 2, and that could really slow down the Mewtwo game plan. So it does have a fair matchup against 2 out of the 3 decks, and then it could even sneak in some wins against the 3rd deck, right, with it being Mewtwo. Again, maybe Fossils get some support later on as the game continues to develop. But again, I do think that Aerodactyl EX is pretty solid. And, hey, you won't notice that ability until it's wrecking your game plan, right? But still relatively cheap attack. Maybe Fighting will get a basic EX that's a really big, bulky Pokemon that can maybe attack for 1 energy and 3 energy. Who knows? We'll see. And, the future could be bright for Aerodactyl EX. Now, another partner that I just mentioned was Marshadow. And originally I had Marshadow at number 13. I've got it moved up to number 9. Now, the thing with Marshadow is it has a really good role in the fighting decks that it occupies, right? And basically every fighting deck, whether it's Golem, whether it's the Aerodactyl Primeape deck, whether it's whatever brew you've got cooking up, Marshadow, if it's a fighting deck, has a pretty solid role. And that's something that I didn't necessarily anticipate when this card was released. I was a little scared of where's this card going to fit, right? And again, I didn't see Hitmonlee being that big of a factor because I didn't necessarily know that Gyarados is going to be as strong as it is. But again, Marshadow, very good 1 prize attacker, can have some impact in the no EX format as well as the regular format. Definitely think it's a card to keep an eye on, and definitely think it deserves a spot on this list at number 9. Now, Golem is a card that honestly I did not see making as big of an impact as it did the first weekend. And honestly, yes, the numbers on Golem have been pretty bad after that tournament. It hasn't necessarily been able to recapture that success in a lot of these big tournaments. However, one of the big things that I would like to point out with this deck is this Golem deck has overtaken Blaine's Ninetales in the no EX format. Right now, not only do you have the Greninja Dredagon Flareon deck, and then you have the Greninja Tentacruel deck that is really massacring the Blaine's deck in the no EX format. You've got Golem, right? And Golem can just straight up tank, multiple Ninetales in some scenarios, right? And hey, that's a really big deal. And so again, when I take a look at this card, I'm looking at it from the angle of this is arguably the best, quote unquote, no EX deck, because you can choose to play with no EXs, maybe in the entire game and to this point, right? So again, Golem, previously not ranked, up to number 8. Again, not a deck that I'm too high on at the moment, just because I don't think that you need to play Golem to play cards like Hitmonlee and Marshadow. I think there's other ways that you can play them, and the bricks with this deck just feel awful, right? Like that's one of the biggest things that I always notice when I play this deck. But again, very respectable card, impacts multiple formats. I think definitely deserves a spot on this list. Now let's talk about a card that I did rate at number 4 previously. Now I slid it down to number 7, is Superior. Superior is a tricky one because you're starting to see Serebii decks basically kind of maybe even phase Superior out of the deck. Now there are times where you're seeing the that Executor Serebii Superior line, but there's some decks that are doing just as well with just Serebii and Executor. So Superior is a really interesting one. I do think that the potential cards like a Rare Candy or Pokemon Breeder could definitely keep this card relevant, and I don't think that it's going to die off anytime soon. I'm just not necessarily sure that it deserves to be as high as I originally had it. Again, I do think that the grass decks are very powerful in some cases, but man, just a stage 2 like this, it's not necessarily as good as Gardevoir in some cases, but it definitely can be better than Gardevoir in some cases, right? But I just look at this card and I think, hey, maybe I rated it just a little bit too high, but it still deserves to be, in that top 7 or that 7 spot. All right, now this is the biggest jumper that I have on the entire list outside of Golem. So 2, non-EX decks, right, or non-EX cards that have been able to impact both formats, the no EX format and the standard format. Dredagon was a card that kind of came out of nowhere, specifically because of another supporter in the set that you may see here very soon. Dredagon, even though you're rarely ever attacking with it, it's either dealing damage or stalling your opponent. And the value when it does that is just tremendous. Previously, I had this card at number 14 on the list, which, is probably higher than a lot of people because a lot of people didn't even rate this card. But after seeing the potential of this card and seeing it played in multiple formats and playing with it myself, I think that this definitely deserves a spot at number 6. I think it's one of the best cards in the entire set, and I think that we're probably going to see Dredagon for a while, right? Maybe they release a card that blocks Pokemon abilities, and maybe that kind of messes with this card. But for right now, in this current time and place, I do think that Dredagon is one of the best cards from Mythical Island. Now, what's a card that Dredagon pairs well with? Well, you guessed it, Leaf. Now, originally I had Leaf at number 9 just because I liked what it did with a lot of pivot, and I think that it continues to do that in multiple decks. I mean, this is a card that you're seeing in a lot of decks. Heck, people are playing it in Pikachu, for goodness sake, right? So Pikachu, Gyarados, Mewtwo, I mean, all these top decks are playing it. Then you've got those decks that are playing Moltres that are playing it. You've got the water decks that are not, Gyarados, Greninja, Dredagon. Every Dredagon deck is playing Leaf. I mean, this card is all over the place. It's very impactful. It's a very interesting card because, a lot of people wanted Switch. And, hey, maybe they did a good job by making Leaf a supporter as opposed to just giving us an item card that does the same thing, or a Pokemon tool. Who knows, that may be coming in the future. But again, Leaf, easily one of the best cards in the set. I have it coming in at number 5. Now let's keep the list going. All right, coming in at number 4. Originally I had it at number 3, so I do think that this card is still just about as good as I thought it was. But again, I slid it down just a little bit just because you can probably guess the top 3 cards by now, right? But again, Serebii EX, very powerful card. Doesn't necessarily need Superior, but it can benefit from it. Cards like Erica just extend the life of this Pokemon. This Pokemon can go toe-to-toe with Pikachu in a head-to-head matchup. I mean, this is just one of the best cards in the set. Now, you may hate coin flips or go have some bad luck with coin flips, but that doesn't necessarily take away from the power that this card has. And again, the biggest weakness is going to be the HP, but without a doubt, one of the best cards in Mythical Island. And, hey, probably going to see it for a while. All right, pretty good card. Coming in at number 3, I previously had it at number 2, is Mew EX. Now, one of the reasons why I have it in the top 3 is because it fits into the Gardevoir Mewtwo EX deck perfectly, and it also slots into fire decks. It slots into, some tech decks, right? Some fighting decks. Have you even played it, right? So you've got this card in a lot of places. And just its presence can change a game because, hey, it can punish your opponent for maybe, maybe having an attacker that's really, really expensive to get going, but maybe you can match up your Mute EX with it, copy that attack, and get the knockout. So again, Mute EX, very powerful card. It does have that synergy with Budding Expeditioner, but again, for one retreat, it's slightly glassy. That's a little bit of a complaint. But again, Mute EX is just about as good as we all were anticipating it to be. And it's definitely delivered in multiple decks. I mean, Executor EX and Mute EX is a deck. Who would have guessed that, looking at the card previews, right? All right, so let's get to the top 2. So coming in at number 2, and I know a lot of people will probably be upset at me for this, but hear me out. Gyarados EX, definitely one of the biggest surprises in the entire set. There was even an article that said Gyarados EX is like the worst EX Pokemon ever printed in Pokemon Pocket so far. That was hilarious to look back on. Previously, I had this rated at number 6, just looking at its stats and its attack. And after seeing this card playing it myself, man, it's got to be the second best card in the set. Now, you could make the argument for it being number 1. However, we'll talk about the number 1 card here in a second, but Gyarados has clear weaknesses, and that one weakness is the Magikarp, right? Outside of that, it's a little bit slow to get building, right? You're going to need Misty in some cases to really stay on track and get back into games. But honestly, the deck that has been pretty much perfected at this point for Gyarados EX is one of the best decks in the game, one of the top 3 decks. It recently won one of the Ursi tournaments, and it's just been one of the best decks that's in the game right now. I mean, the whole meta kind of warped around playing cards like Hitmonlee and Zebstrika just because Gyarados EX exists. So, again, Gyarados EX, it's one of the best cards in the game right now. The power creep of 180 HP has proven to be legitimate. And, hey, now we know, right? One of the biggest takeaways from this card, and if you haven't heard anything else in this video, one of the biggest takeaways in this card is now you know what to look for when we get this 200 card set. What are the stats on a Pokemon? Even if the attack doesn't seem like a direct benefit for you, what are the stats on the card? What's the HP? And then is it a stage 1, right? That's one of the first things that we'll be looking for now that we kind of have an idea in Pokemon Pocket about how power creep may impact the meta. So be looking at that, and Gyarados has taught us many lessons, but I know you're waiting for it. Let's talk about the only card in the entire set that I think is better than Gyarados EX. So the card that I think that's better than Gyarados EX is Mythical Slab. Mythical Slab is a card that I think it took a little bit of time for people to learn how to play, and I think that the best way to play this card is to hold it until you need to fish for your stage 1 or stage 2. I think that's the best way to play this card. Similar to how I used to say, hold your Professor's Research. Don't just feel like you have to rip it as soon as you draw it, turn 1 specifically. But I think that that's probably the best case in getting value out of your Mythical Slab, right? If you hold it until the moment that you need to find that stage 1 or stage 2, I think you're going to get more value out of it than just randomly ripping it and potentially putting stuff at the bottom of your deck that you might want to hold and see at a particular time, right? And when you take a look at this card, it's going to probably be played in every Psychic deck for the foreseeable future, right? Not just Mewtwo Gardevoir, which is obviously one of the most powerful decks, but even in these little rogue decks that are playing Alakazam, these little rogue decks that are playing Gengar, and who knows what kind of support the Psychic type is going to get, because here's the one thing that you need to know about the Pokemon Company. They love Psychic types, right? They love them, okay? Now, with all that in mind, it feels future-proofed, it feels powerful right now, and Psychic is the only card, or the only type that has a card like this. And for those reasons, that's why I have it as still being the best card in the set, one of the best cards in the entire game outside of the obvious ones like Professor's Research. And that's why I still think that the video that I put out where I said this card breaks the game still rings true. Now, there was a weekend where some people were playing like one of these in their deck, and that's just bad. Okay, I'm just gonna be honest with you. That's just bad. You play 2 of these, and hey, like I said, if you hold it, if you learn how to play this card instead of just ripping it as soon as you play it, I do think that you'll get more mileage out of it. And there may be scenarios where you never have to play the card, but you still had it just in case you needed to go fishing for that extra stage 1 or stage 2. So there's my top 15 cards revisited. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know, did I miss a card? Did I have a card rated too high, too low? Let me know in the comments. And again, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe I was entertainment. Maybe you learned something. But as always, I appreciate you for tuning in, and I hope that you hit that subscribe button on the bottom right of the video so that way you can get more notifications on my content and the videos that I upload. But thank you so much, and until next time, peace.